So now comes the hard part. The intention of the section I'm going to go through now is more of the high level, what is this stuff about when we talk about this risk violation curve we're proposing, try and explain the concepts, similar to what, obviously what's in the consultation paper, but there's a few other bits and pieces we've added to try and expand on that. And then for those that wants the real nitty-gritty detail, then Ramu will be here after lunch to step through that and go through some worked examples. And I just want to pay, to really acknowledge that for me personally, I think this has been the hardest part of the project by an enormous margin. And I don't think we would have got the solution that we do have if it wasn't for Ramu's efforts and also my colleague Tong Nguyen in the market performance side of the authority. This has been a difficult and challenging process, but we're very pleased with where we've ended up. What am I going to talk about right now then? A very brief background on what we mean by reserve shortfalls and how we deal with them today. To explain where the challenge lies in continuing that under real-time pricing. Discuss at a conceptual level and a little bit of detail what we're proposing with our risk violation curve. And as I say, some of the hardcore detail we'll punt to after lunch. And then highlight some of the trade-offs and the judgments that are involved in choosing those, the values, configuring the dials for implementing those curves. Now, I haven't got anything here to first of all define what we mean by reserve. Does anyone want me to go through that quickly? No? Okay, so I can assume most people know what we're talking about when we say instantaneous reserve, or for simplicity's sake, we just refer to it as reserve. Now, the long-standing practice is if we're looking at shortfalls in supply so that we might otherwise need to shed load, as David described before, we would instead move to sacrifice reserve cover, meaning that we're running at a higher level of operational security risk, deliberately so, because we're choosing to avoid the absolute certainty of shedding load now. And the way that we do that is we sacrifice, as a shorthand, spinning reserve, meaning supply that can be used to instead provide or meet the demand for energy. Interruptible load still has a role to play there, because if you could have more interruptible load available, you could then free up some of those generation sources to, as I say, instead meet the demand for energy and keep the lights on, avoid any load. Well, I shouldn't say keep the lights on. It'd be more like not use, say, ripple control or dimming some lights, because even if we're going to load shedding, it doesn't mean we're shutting down, streets at the feeder level initially. I mean, you might. Depends how bad it is. A really fundamental point is that reserve shortfall, in the way I've just described conceptually, is not a choice. It's not an act that the system operator or anyone else does by manually intervening or picking up the phone. I mean, it's something that's inherent and an automated outcome as part of SPD's co-optimization process. So very briefly, what SPD, the system operator's scheduling, pricing, and dispatch tool, which really is the core of the market, the spot market system, its task is to find the least cost dispatch solution in order to meet that expected demand in real time, and also to procure enough of those insurance resources through reserve to cover the largest risks that are expected to be, or that are going to be part of that dispatch solution. So SPD is optimizing across generator offers, dispatchable demand bids, and then reserve offers, subject to a whole range of model constraints, which sort of put limits or boundaries around what SPD can do. And for some of those, there are these constraint violation penalties as dollar values, as prices, which helps SPD determine what order it should, or how to prioritize certain actions if it does need to breach some of those constraints. And an important part of that entire process is that, and this is quite potentially unique actually, it's certainly not common around the world, is that reserve and the underlying risks that reserve is covering, so the largest scheduled generator or the largest transmission circuit, that is determined dynamically for each 30-minute trading period as part of this co-optimization process. And what that means is that shortfalls in reserve cover to instead meet the demand for energy are an inherent outcome of that process. And really, to reiterate, it's not that we put a price on some external intervention or manual override. The going into reserve shortfall is determined by SPD because it's the least cost dispatch solution. And the way that works today is that the CVP for an energy deficit, which would mean load shedding somewhere on the system, is set at $500,000 a megawatt hour, whereas going into reserve deficit is much cheaper comparatively at $100,000 a megawatt per hour. But again, it's important to recognise that that does not guarantee that reserve shortfall would always occur before we went into load shedding. In fact, it's entirely possible that with a different set of offers today, without going into the reasons why, you might get different results and you might not end up going to reserve deficit before you went into load shedding. As I say, today, conceptually, in normal conditions, you procure enough reserve to cover the maximum risk. And in this consultation paper, in order to help explain it, and also for us to explain it to ourselves, we've introduced some new terms. I mean, they're not going to be in the code, but we found them really helpful to elaborate and understand how this all fits together. So, very simple diagram. What we're trying to show here on the left with this risk A, that's, say, its largest generator, and that's its megawatt quantity that it's been scheduled for. So it defines the maximum risk, and then in normal conditions, you procure enough reserve in order to meet that actual maximum risk. So the amount of reserve that you have scheduled on the system is the maximum covered risk, meaning that's the megawatt quantity of failure that you can tolerate where reserve would be able to cover that contingent event. So of course, normally, oh, wrong button. Normally the two should be equivalent. And I'm kind of skipping over some of the details here around the difference between the two reserve products, fast instantaneous reserve and sustained instantaneous reserve. I'm not going to touch on net free reserve and how that affects the quantity of FIR, etc. So this is at a higher level of abstraction for the moment. Now, today, the reality is that reserve shortfalls can happen in real time in the dispatch schedule. And if they do, then that, because you're breaching one of those constraints that I referred to earlier, well, specifically the reserve deficit constraint, you've now got an infeasibility, which means that SPD couldn't find an optimal solution without breaking one of those constraints. And in this particular instance, it's a reserve infeasibility. So prices will go to $100,000 or something around that level. It might depend on how many simultaneous risks there are. But in reality, they don't tend to flow through into the ex-post 30-minute final pricing schedule because we're using 30-minute averages. If they did, and it has happened, but not very often, I think it's, what, 2 or 3 times? Anyone remember? Yeah, twice in the last 4 years. If it does happen, meaning if there's a reserve infeasibility in that 30-minute final pricing schedule, well, we have to get rid of it. The way we get rid of it is not pretty. It's called the virtual reserve provider. Essentially, we just fake some reserve and keep adding on the megawatts until we get to the point where the situation becomes, sorry, the solution goes feasible again. That tells us how much you need. Now you've got to put a price on it. So that's set to be 3 times the highest cleared energy offer or the highest cleared reserve offer for the relevant reserve class or classes, and whichever one of those is the highest. But of course you can't know that until you've been through that whole process. So you absolutely can't know what price you might expect for a reserve shortfall ahead of time.
So is this coinciding with those infamous $112,000
yeah, that's right.
spot prices we saw, which fortunately aren't as frequent now?
Yeah.
But so that's the signal for what's happening there, is it?
Exactly. It's almost certainly a reserve in feasibility, but not necessarily. And you just don't know. And you don't know what the final price is going to be. For a start, you don't know if it's going to flow through to final pricing. Most of the time, clearly they don't. But it's not guaranteed one way or the other. Now, so this VRP process is, depends on your point of view. Personally, I think it's very cumbersome. It's certainly manual, and it can only be done by definition because we're using ex-post pricing that you do the next day. So it's a whole series of manual interventions. Clearly, we cannot do that in real time when we're talking about moving to these ex-ante dispatch prices or prices that are struck now looking ahead for the next roughly 5 minutes. As I've already really said, those prices are not deterministic. They change based on the particular offers or on the solution that SPD might end up with after it's applied that VRP process. You could describe that as a dynamic price cap, but you only find out what it is later. And even if those the VRP is used, it's very likely not reflecting the economic cost of scarcity. And the fact that it has only been used twice in the last 4 years means that we're not putting, we're not showing the economic costs of those instances of reserve shortfall in our current final pricing situation. And over time, that can lead to a lack of investment in reserve supply, which is obviously a significant problem in an energy-only market. Now, in the consultation paper, in one of the sections when we moved into this discussion of reserve shortfalls, we talked about the fundamental principle. That was a condensed version of what I'm trying to articulate here. So in grappling with this ourselves, we decided it was pretty important to define these principles. What exactly do we mean with real-time pricing? What are we trying to achieve? So the first principle is that getting the prices right, and that applies obviously today as well, is critical to operating an energy-only market efficiently, because you need to put to show the economic cost of scarcity when you don't have enough. If you don't, then you're not going to have sufficient investment over the long term. To achieve that principle, we have principle 2. In order to get real-time pricing, we must always produce a real price, a real spot price in real time. And to really hammer that point, it's the edge cases. It's the things that happen once or twice a year or once every 3 years. If you can't have a robust solution to handle them, you can't have certainty that you're going to be able to have a price when it really matters in real time. And then to achieve that second principle, we have principle 3, meaning that really they're saying the same thing, but just to cement it. The system, the underlying spot market system, must always produce a result, a feasible result, even when supply is not sufficient. And as a consequence of all of that, the system should reflect the underlying economic cost of marginal outcomes in the market. And as I say, the hard part is when things aren't quite working as you would hope, when you're in those really tight market conditions and you're facing shortfalls. Technically, that means that those infeasibilities that I briefly defined before, they must, by definition, they must no longer be possible under real-time pricing. I think it was Hamish the other day who said the answer must always be in the machine, all right? So SPD must always be able to give you a real price by finding a feasible solution. So there are 2 important ways that, as part of this overall real-time pricing design, that serve that objective. The first and the in terms of where we are today, the long-standing principle, design element is these default energy scarcity pricing blocks that David's just been talking about. No, of course, David's talking about both of them, sorry. As I said earlier, what that means is that all load inputs, so all of the inputs representing load that go into SPD's optimization process now have a price. In the real-time dispatch schedule, if your dispatchable demand and you've said you're prepared to be dispatched, the price in your bid serves that role. For everything else, you get assigned into these 3 default scarcity pricing blocks. The other part of the other component that serves this objective is CVPs, or some substitute for reserve shortfalls which mean that when we go into reserve shortfall, we now have a real price for that as well. This is a simplified diagram of the concept with those default energy scarcity pricing blocks. So really what it's doing is it's closing the demand curve, as repeating myself really, but everything has a price assigned. So there's it's not just a vertical line, as you might conventionally draw demand in real time. It now goes back to the origin. So SPD can always find a solution because it can always, basically it's kind of acting as a closed system. So in normal conditions, of course, where demand intersects the supply curve, the stack of generator offers, that would give you a price. And I haven't shown dispatchable demand because that further refines this blue curve, but and actually by the same token, it should be more correctly drawn with a bit of a slope to reflect that voluntary demand response to prices. But the concept is really, as I say, it's now all joined up. So there's no gaps left, meaning SPD can always find a feasible solution. Now, what we said, this diagram, that's annoying. Oh no, sorry. This diagram is what we showed in 2017, just trying to illustrate conceptually what we mean by the order that you would expect these things to occur. So most of the time you're going to be down here, prices will be set by the intersection of supply and demand using your normal generation offers. Again, of course, dispatchable demand could be there as well. And then what we said was, before that first default scarcity pricing block, oh no, I did. At the moment proposed to start at $10,000 a megawatt hour, you would have some mechanism, some constraint violation penalty, but using a real price, and that price would be just below that first default scarcity pricing block at $10,000. Now, the reality is, conceptually that's correct, but doing that is much more complicated. And I think it's fair to say that in the consultation paper in 2017, we described this at a reasonably high level. We had a plan for how that would work, but when it came to detailed design, with much hair pulling, we realised that that plan wasn't going to work, so we needed to come up with something else. And I'll show you very briefly, I'll take you very briefly on our little journey there. What are we trying to do then? The objective here is, as I say, we want to sacrifice reserve before we're shedding load, and we want to do so by integrating scarcity pricing. Now, unlike today where there is, if you go into reserve deficit, there's really no limit. You could, in theory, just use it all up and have no reserve cover whatsoever. In practice, you probably wouldn't because interruptible load would still be there. But certainly there's nothing in the design that sets any quantity limit. And again, we want reserve prices to reflect economic costs. The challenges are, how do we handle multiple risk setters? And how do we do that in a way that doesn't suppress energy prices? And the reason I say that, I'll explain a little later. Again, this is a fairly, if not an absolutely unique feature of New Zealand's market in the fact, because we're a smaller system and because we need to be nimble in the way that we procure reserve, because the size of individual generators means that the risk can fluctuate from one trading period to the next, and you can have multiple sources of risk at the same level. So, for example, you could have, forgive me if I get this wrong, Huntley 5 and TCC might be scheduled for the same megawatt quantity, so that's 2. You could also have the HVDC, so you'd have 3 simultaneous risk setters, meaning 3 simultaneous sources at that same actual maximum risk megawatt quantity. We also want to be able to try and allow both FIR and SIR to go into deficit, and obviously combinations of the above. But the biggest problem has been handling multiple risk setters. In fact, if that didn't exist, what I sketched earlier with just a single CVP would have been quite straightforward. It absolutely isn't, and the challenge here is to find a robust way to deal with that.
How actually
We thought you might ask that question. Do either of you want to say anything?
Some frantic scrambling around our databases last night I uncovered. I think we had this conversation back in November, December. In final pricing at the moment, we're scheduling multiple risk setters maybe 3% of the time in the North Island for fur and sur. And if you look at the dispatch schedules as they are at the moment, we're actually seeing it more often, more closer to 10% of the time for fur and about 9.5% of the time for sur.
But again, to reiterate, that's just a function of available resources and offers today. There's no reason why it couldn't be much more frequent. And even if it wasn't, the fact is we have to handle that. We have to be robust to that. Did you want to say anything on that point, Roman? No? David's really covered this anyway, but I guess just a further restatement of what's the role of energy and reserve prices when we don't have enough. Operationally, in real time, we want price signals to give accurate information about the best use of resources. Where's the most valuable use for any capacity that is still available? Perhaps it could be offered into reserve, or it may be best to be offered into energy, and similarly to encourage voluntary demand response. So you want your energy and your reserve prices to give you accurate information about the real-time conditions in the power system. And then, as we've said a few times now, over time, you want the average of those prices over time to provide that critical role of signalling that more investment in capacity would be valuable, and to support that investment. So in economic speak, it's addressing the missing money problem that you can have with an energy-only market. And I guess in some ways, because of the way that we deal with pricing today, we've never really had to tackle this at this level of detail or sophistication. So the problem is that the way that we deal with reserve shortfalls today, by using that reserve deficit constraint, it just doesn't work under real-time pricing. And the principal reason for that is the presence of these multiple risk setters. In theory, you would want to be able to replace that $100,000 placeholder value with something that was real. As I said before, it'd be logically sort of below that first scarcity pricing block, so maybe $8,000, $9,000. The problem is, if you have multiple risk setters, an inherent property of the way these constraints work is that you actually suppress the energy price, and that's quite perverse. So the more risks that you have that are becoming uncovered, if you go into a reserve shortfall, the lower the energy price. And that's really not what you want. And then beyond that, for that same reason, it leads to inconsistent, uneconomic, and largely unreasonable outcomes. So for example, if you configured the CVP in a way that could, say, handle 3 risk setters, it would mean no reserve shortfall at all for 1 risk setter, and then vice versa. There's just no way to cut it that you can handle them both, or handle these potential permutations. And in the paper, we said we'd release some more modelling detail. So we've got a pack of information, including the underlying model output from VSPD, as well as a whole series of slides built using a simplified model in Excel to illustrate all this stuff. So we'll be publishing that on Tuesday, along with the slides here. As well as Rama will be going through some of it later this afternoon. No, I've probably said that enough. I won't say the last line. Oh yeah, okay. We'll show you later the real detail there. So what's our solution? What we're proposing, and we think it's a very elegant answer to this challenge, is to move what we call a risk violation curve. So what that would do conceptually is it sets a rising price for reserve or on reserve as the quantity of any reserve shortfall is growing, and that represents the increasing economic cost from leaving sources of risk uncovered. Within SPD's model formulation, that would mean we move, or in fact we remove, the existing constraints on reserve deficit, and instead we put them on the risk sources themselves. So there'd be a risk violation sort of variable that's assigned to each potential source, generation units, transmission circuits, etc. And an inherent property of doing that means that we can handle these multiple risk setters. As well, we would also integrate a progressive reserve shortfall with the load shedding indicated by those default energy scarcity pricing blocks. So rather than using a single number, we'll have a series of price quantity steps, and that then forms a curve. Really, it's a twin to the three blocks, the curve that we're proposing for energy scarcity. We're applying the same conceptual approach to reserve shortfalls. And that would mean that depending on how we configure those curves, you should have load shedding, you should go into reserve shortfall first, but not necessarily, and it is possible based on those economic costs that load shedding in some nodes might occur before all reserve is exhausted, which is unlike the situation today. To illustrate that, what we've done here is we've drawn those three default scarcity pricing blocks as percentage quantities of energy shortfall. And I think maybe the 5% there might not be drawn correctly. From memory, I did this by hand, but you get the point. And similarly, this is not the actual dollar values we're proposing. It's just to illustrate the concept. And actually, there would be a different curve for both FIR and SIR, but as I say, conceptually, just to illustrate, I've just shown the one here. So the question then is, what shape should that curve be? If it's quite a sharp rise, or it starts at a higher level, you would send a strong price signal, but you're going to restrain the amount of reserve shortfall you can actually have before you move into load shedding. If it's gentler, if it's lower down, or there are a lot of steps, you would move through sort of intermediate prices for reserve scarcity, and then the quantities you assign to that would determine how much shortfall before you get to before you get into energy shortfall. These diagrams are in the paper, so I probably won't spend too much time on them, but just again, conceptually, what we have today is we've got sources of risk here, and then that determines, so if there's only one risk setter, that determines the quantity of instantaneous reserve we're trying to obtain. And if we went into shortfall, then essentially that penalty price applies to the deficit in the reserve quantity. So if there were three simultaneous risks, we would still, at the same, actual maximum risk megawatt quantity, we would still be scheduling that target quantity of reserve, and that target quantity is obviously not influenced directly by the fact that there are multiple risk setters. So again, if we went into reserve shortfall, it would only be the deficit on the quantity of reserve itself. And let's say we set that CVP quite low at $4,500 to account for multiple risk setters. That would also have the effect of not allowing energy offers greater than $1,500 to clear. And clearly that would have quite a suppressing effect on the use of sort of higher cost or last resort resources offered into the market. What we propose to do instead is to set those constraints as these risk violation variables onto the sources of risk itself. So again, you would still have the quantity of reserve being scheduled as normal, but if there was a risk violation, then the penalty applies to that quantity that you're not covering for that specific risk. Similarly, if there were three risk setters and we went into reserve shortfall, then the penalty applies to all three of those risks. So if multiple risks was the optimal solution, then the price for reserve would rise and probably rise above the price for energy, reflecting the scale of risk that you're no longer covering through your procured reserve. And that higher reserve price would reflect the value to the system of 1 more megawatt of reserve. So in this context, if you had 3 risks, then if you could free up, or if you had another megawatt of reserve, that could free up 3 megawatts of energy. So that the higher price would now much more accurately reflect the underlying economic costs and the risks that you're incurring in real time. This is perhaps a little bit too down into the detail for the moment, but another point is that under this new model, so in this panel, risk A would set that actual maximum risk as the largest scheduled source of risk. If you go into reserve shortfall, so you've only got this much shown in the green, then you've got violation on both risk A and risk B, but at different quantities. In this context, both of them would be known as binding risks. And similarly, if in a different situation, your quantity of reserve or the maximum covered risk was now equal to a second risk, that would also become a binding risk. I kind of realise now I probably shouldn't have even put this slide in here. Let's forget this, and if those of you with the stamina can stay around this afternoon, and Rama will go into this in more detail. So going back to the concept, we think this risk violation curve is a robust solution. We think it's quite elegant. We're confident that it's strong and future-proof. It can handle any combination of offers or permutations. We don't have any similar problem as we would today. So the somewhat arbitrary ratio of the current CVPs between $100,000 for reserve deficit and $500,000 for energy deficit kind of means you could have, say, up to 5 simultaneous risk setters, but what happens if you've got 6? You start getting outcomes that you wouldn't expect. None of that would apply here. This solution can handle any permutation that we can imagine into the future. And beyond that, we think it is cementing and strongly adhering to those 3 principles that I set out earlier. It really is about getting the prices right. So these curves would be based on economic costs. SPD would then trade off those costs through its co-optimization process, and the outcomes would be reasonable, consistent for a given set of conditions, and economically justifiable. And we think this is a marked improvement on the status quo, because we're not arbitrarily devaluing energy or reserve. We're not using made-up numbers. We would no longer be masking conditions on the power system. So when the degree of risk is changing and growing, prices would rise to reflect that. And also by definition, because we're doing this in real time, instances of reserve shortfall in the dispatch schedule would show up into those dispatch prices. Would produce dispatch prices that would then be part of the final price for the trading period. This method allows, we're introducing a form of optimization around the risks themselves, or perhaps more accurately, better revealing that through the price mechanism. And we think that would allow participants to more effectively trade around those characteristics. So then the question is, how do we configure the curves? And as David said before, there's a whole series of considerations you would have, but ultimately it requires trade-offs and a degree of judgment. I don't intend to go through this now, but this table from the paper is just trying to illustrate that there are a range of things you need to consider. So for example, if you wanted to have a high price, so the curves would be logically sort of higher vertically, that would give you a strong scarcity pricing signal, but it would also mean you're less likely to go into reserve shortfall before energy deficit. You're less likely to be able to have both FIR, or in fact you might not be able to at all, have both FIR and SIR go into deficit. And then similar effects in quantity. So the consultation paper set out 2 sort of principal scenarios that we used to model what that curve might look like. And the version that we proposed to adopt, which was that lower price version. Again, Rama will go into that later on. including with some worked examples. As I've just said a little while ago, we're going to publish those modelling results and some more supporting material to give you as much information as we can on what led us to that conclusion. And again, these dollar values would be reviewed as part of that overall assessment of the scarcity pricing values in the code. So we would come back to this as part of that process before RTP goes live. Right. Any questions?
So it's just more a question about risk setting, which might go back a few sections. But is it possible for a dispatch light aggregator generator to be a risk setter? And the scenario I've got in mind is that, sorry, I haven't thought this through, so
no, that's fine.
Just going back to think. So I'm a company that set up arrangements with 15 battery owners, each of which are 10 megawatts. So in your example there, you've got a 10 megawatt. Just imagine I've got 15 of those. So in theory, I've got 150 megawatts that I'm offering in, but I have different compliance requirements. So I can just decide to say, no, I'm not interested, I'll just ride the spot price. So sort of a double banger question there of, would that be counted as a risk? Would it be just tens, in which case presumably not, or is it 150? And then just thinking through how that feeds through the risk setting process, and is it even possible? I was just reading through the paper, I'm not clear if a generator aggregator is possible, because we talk about a load aggregator. So it's a bit of a double banger question, but I just wondered if you thought about it.
I guess the first point is, in theory, anything could be a risk setter, but that would be extraordinarily unlikely, given for the generation light version of that proposal, there's a limit at 30 megawatts. Who knows what the future conditions say in 20 years' time, but... Hamish, do you want to...
I can give a go.
Sure.
So a useful present-day analogy might be that of a wind farm. So a wind farm is made up of multiple 2 or 5 or 10 megawatt kind of turbines. But when we look at the risk, we're looking at the risk on a single unit rather than the risk of the whole wind farm. Now, whether that's accurate or not, I mean, I think that's a question for another day. But there's in that sort of situation, as Justin says, it's reasonably unlikely that you would find yourself as the risk setter, especially with the presence of large plant like TCC and Huntly 5 still in the market.
So yeah, I had thought through that. The difference is that under dispatch light, I'm not having to dispatch my wind farm. I've got, in my scenario, 15 times 10 megawatts that are offered in, but then I can just say no, which is possibly different conditions to the gate closure requirements for other generation. That's the catch, is that as a dispatch light aggregated generator, I've got a kind of different game I can play, which is always one of the discussions back in the day of that to the extent you get participants engaging in the market, and you think you can influence the market, as highlighted in the back end of your paper, there's a degree of market influence that a party might have.
Can I just throw a comment in on there? One of the considerations with the system operator with allowing you to become a dispatch light generator would be a security consideration. So if those are the kind of things that the system operator would look at in the process of approving any particular applications, that maybe it goes through and the system operator looks at that risk, says, no, actually, we can split you down into 3 lots of 5 and you dispatch separately. Really, if you didn't offer dispatch, you could do the same behavior anyway and have the same effect, but distributed around the country. So how it's treated in the market system would depend on how you configured it. The market system the SO might decide you actually treat you as separate 10 megawatt blocks instead of one big aggregated 150 for the purposes of dispatch, and then just something happens at your end.
Well, you couldn't be aggregated to a 150 offer. If you wanted to be, you'd have to be offered generation. So in that scenario, you'd need to be 15 individual participants. But yeah, I don't think that scenario should have any direct bearing on this risk violation curve proposal. But over time, if you had more and more, a larger number of smaller individual units, then yeah, that may change the dynamics on the system. And we probably need to be, or the system operator would need to be addressing that in any case, no matter what mechanism we might have in place for handling reserve shortfalls.
Can I also just make a quick comment? I mean, it seems to me partly this is an empirical issue. You know, would it actually be a problem in practice? And I guess one observation I would make is that we're talking about a situation where prices are likely to be quite high, and for a generator to say, I'm going to withdraw my generation and forego that opportunity to earn a high price, I think is a question that you'd want to ask what the incentives are. Don't rule it out, but I think it's first up you'd expect the reverse probably to apply. And I guess equally on the demand side, if you've got demand who's saying, I mean, here we're talking about reserve issues, which is, you know, demand actually has to go up. It's to say, well, I said I'd be off at that price, but actually I'm going to consume at that price. So again, I think the same sort of incentives probably apply, but it's certainly something that bears probably more thought.
And then, of course, there's good trading conduct as well. So,
Does that apply to dispatch light?
Is a good question. As it stands today, or rather in the code amendment as it stands today, it would apply to generators because dispatch light generators would be submitting offers, and offers are subject to the trading conduct provisions. At the moment, bids are not subject to those trading conduct provisions, but that's a question that's being considered elsewhere. So as we've said in the paper, whatever happens in that space, we would update that, or rather those changes would apply to dispatch light in any case, because we certainly haven't taken any steps to exclude them from trading conduct. So I guess just going back onto dispatch light itself, the point there is we've proposed something that gives you a lot of flexibility. So you can say no, but you can't abuse it. And if there was evidence that you were manipulating that to try and, even though it's hard to see how you could get particular financial advantage of doing so, then we would absolutely treat that accordingly. You might be kicked out of the system. And then, as I say, depending on what happens with the trading conduct rules, you might be potentially in breach of the code in any case. So dispatch light is about giving people flexibility based on the characteristics of the load or the smaller scale generation that they want to provide. It's not a way to get in there and start behaving deviously.
I've got a question from Alan Holden. How would HVDC outages be handled, and would each island have its own curve?
Yes, each island would have its own curve. I think that's correct to say. I mean, they would be the same curve, but in effect, because you're procuring reserve in multiple islands, these curves would apply to the prices for answer in each island. Not quite sure what you mean by how it. I mean, this process doesn't do anything to dictate how reserve is scheduled. Well, that's not quite true, is it? What am I trying to say? Yeah, the way HVDC outages are treated would continue. It doesn't have a direct bearing. Using these risk violation curves doesn't have a direct bearing on that process. Is there anything you want to say on that point?
Yeah. I guess there is some implication. I guess there is some implication on the scheduling process about whether we have reserve sharing or not between the islands. So an HVDC outage would preclude that. But SPD takes that into account now, and there are people probably here that are far more knowledgeable about NMIR than I am. So there is that, I guess, added complexity, and there are different situations depending on which plant is in service. But as Justin has said, we're not intending to change the way we handle how the system is configured for those particular outages. We're just looking at how reserve shortfalls should be priced.
And I suppose at a high level, we're substituting those current arrangements with the existing reserve deficit CVP, which is there now anyway, when we're replacing it with something more sophisticated.
Hi, Bruce Rogers from Orion. As I vaguely recall, energy prices and reserve prices can interact in certain circumstances, so they kind of pile up on top of each other, to be very technical. How does that work when you're sort of, in a sense, looking up prices? Can that interaction still occur?
Yeah, absolutely. So depending on the marginal energy source, if some of these risk violation curves are binding so that they're setting reserve prices, that could in turn directly affect the energy price.
In this case is like a virtual source. So how do you... I guess the point I'll get to is that if you're saying that the energy scarcity price is effectively set somewhere around vol, if somehow the combination of the reserve and the energy price makes the price higher than that, you're actually saying that the economically efficient price is a price higher than the price people would have been prepared to turn off at. So just maybe think about, if the interaction can occur, it probably shouldn't be able to when you're using virtual sources. So
yeah, it couldn't go... Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean by virtual sources, but it couldn't go... Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So currently, there has to be a mechanism within SPD to produce prices in real time. It has to be able to, as Justin said, close the loop. And closing the loop currently happens, but through uneconomic prices, these CVPs. And so they pop up in real time, and all you see is $100,000 price, and that's as good as whatever you take it to be, because you're not sure what's going to happen. And so what's proposed is some economic prices that are reflective of something more tangible. So it is virtual in the sense that it means a shortfall, but it's reflecting what, on balance, if the values are set reasonably in the range, they're reflective of what New Zealand is willing to accept in terms of a reduced security risk.
And going back to the other part of your question, the reserve price could be quite elevated. If it affects the energy price directly to the point where the energy price, to use the term you used, goes up to that vol level, so that at least that first energy default scarcity pricing block at $10,000, well, that block would become binding. So SPD would then schedule some degree of energy deficit load shedding as lower cost than continuing to incur a rising quantity of reserve shortfall. So the two are obviously tightly coupled and interrelated in that sense. So this wouldn't be a way of bypassing those vol values, as it were.
My question is going to be on that same subject as what Bruce has raised, and as a user, we don't have a good understanding now of how decisions taken in terms of interruptible load going into the reserves markets directly impact onto the energy price. We know it can make
difference and does make a difference when things are under stress, and that's not necessarily getting into the scarcity situations we've been talking about now. So my question is, are all these changes likely to make that more visible and easily understood, both from the participant and potentially for the overall betterment of getting an efficient result for that trading period?
I'll try and answer that. The proposed risk violation approach, or whatever is being proposed, does not affect anything in these near scarcity situations. When if you get like $2,000-3,000 prices in the market, as you would currently, the way reserves are priced, you rightly point out, is that at that time the price of reserve is no longer determined by the offer price; it's determined by the opportunity SPD thinks it can best use that reserve. So it's priced at really like its opportunity cost. So if that 1 megawatt of reserve can free up some energy, then that's how the reserve and energy price become linked currently. I've got a whole bunch of maybe worked examples that we can step through that can show how these linkages work and how these prices become reflective of these of each other. But the point was that this risk violation will not touch any of that. Only when we get into a point of reserve shortfall, that's when the risk violation will come out, and it will be if you spend time and work through it, which we will work through it this afternoon. It makes sense, but it's kind of, because there's so many moving parts, it can be a bit opaque. Yep. So.
I think in general it should. It's certainly much more transparent and understandable. Maybe that's not the right word. More transparent than the current situation. So again, and until these things come into play, then it works the same as it does now. But you won't see this $100,000 or some derivation of that. You'll see a price that's real. It may be based on difficult technical complexities, but it's real information, unlike those infeasibility prices that we have at the moment.
My next question was going to be, I've got a reasonable understanding of what we went through with scarcity pricing there and how you've arrived at it all. I think what I would find really useful this afternoon is if some of the discussion and examples could look at it from us great unwashed users sitting there looking at our WIT screen as to how these various scenarios might play out in the lead up to the trading period and what's happening during the trading period.
Yep. Sure. I mean, I guess that's a good point, actually. Another characteristic of everything we're proposing with real-time pricing, not guaranteed, certainly not necessarily, but if some form of scarcity condition is looming in the the hours or the half hour or whatever ahead, it should show up in the forward schedules as well, and it would show up in the same way, so that those prices would be real. Again, they wouldn't just be using these placeholder dummy values, but with the caveat that it might not manifest until sort of close to real time, or it may be less visible because of half-hour averages for those forward schedules. But to stress, compared to the status quo today, it's certainly much more accurate information, and there's not much else you can do to predict outcomes until you actually get to the point where they're happening.
That's where I think it would be useful from my point of view to actually talk through some scenarios in that lead up period. And most of the time now, I think, certainly those infeasible start turning up ahead of time. I'm not talking 12 hours ahead of time, but 1 or 2 trading periods ahead at least.
Yeah, so that would definitely apply, and hopefully with more accuracy and just overall better information than we have today.